What is up, Whale family, and welcome to Blockchain Beats, where we explore the pioneering artists taking audio and music to the next level of emerging tech and interactivity with NFTs. Our guest today is Tor of Studio Nouveau, one half of the creative duo leveraging the capabilities of Web3 to experiment and push boundaries with their richly composed electronic music and multimedia visual artistry. Tor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Really excited to talk with you. A little background: we joined the Whale server right around the same time, and I recall, seeing you frequently shortly after I came in the summer of 2020. Speaking often about audio NFTs and some different things you were doing, and been following you since, and you've really been a bellwether for me in that arena and seeing what artists were doing, some of the different things that were, hot topics of discussion, as well as really pushing boundaries with your own multimedia integration of the tech and what you can do with audio. So I was always intrigued to follow you, but really didn't know a lot about you and your artist background and how you came to be where you are in the space. So love the opportunity and so happy that you've come and joined us today. For people in the audience that may not be as familiar with, your endeavors and yourself, could you give us a little bit of a background on you and your journey in music?
Sure. So basically, Studio Nouveau is dedicated to combining music and multimedia art, and that's been our mission since the beginning. Um, but we basically started around the time of the COVID pandemic. And prior to that, I made my living as a professional musician. So based in New York City, basically for my entire adult life, I was working as a freelance guitarist. Um, and so, I had a really great career. And my spouse, Kaya, they are they're a visual artist. We met in college. They studied painting. I was a music major. So we've been together all the while. But Q early 2020, things were going great with my music career. And as soon as the pandemic hit, live music just ended immediately, basically across the world.
Right.
And so I've been in crypto, however, since like mid 2017. So I've had an interest in blockchain, and I've always, since then, being a professional musician and a composer, I've always been really interested in how blockchain would interact with the music industry. But I really didn't have my light bulb moment with the NFTs until early 2020. And so basically, when all my my work was halted, I really saw an opportunity to kind of pursue my passion, which was the intersection of music and blockchain and art, which I can kind of explain that a little better. But that's kind of a little starting point there.
And a great one, some of that news to me. So, like I said, a lot of people keen to get more of a foundation and everything that makes up you and your artistry. You said you were a professional musician. Let me backtrack just a little bit. In your youth, was there professional training? Was it something that you were always interested in as a youth or exposure to with your family?
Yeah, I don't come from a particularly musical family. I think, I have 3 brothers, and I think, there is sort of like an inclination towards it. But I'm, from a small town, and I had a really good public school music program. And I think from a pretty early age, like elementary school, it just felt like something that I excelled at. And just for that, when there's something that you like feel like you do well, you want to keep doing it. And so, whether it was participating in like the school musicals, or like singing in the choir, or playing in the concert band, and playing in rock bands with my friends, like I just was all over the place. And so from that early age, I just ran with it, and it was always the thing that I just knew that I wanted to participate. And I've always been all over the place with my interests, which kind of makes sense in terms of how things are with Studio Nouveau. So
Yeah, the space is definitely a playground for creatives and people that have that kind of creative energy. Before we get much further, I'd love to level set everybody and give them an example of your work that you've put out there. And again, this is a combination of visual, work that you guys have done through various means, and I want to talk about the methodologies as well, and your musicianship. So, I thought a good one to kind of set the foundation for everyone would be Ascension. All right. I gotta tell you, when I first started really, looking into a lot of your music, I was taken aback by how layered it is, how rich with texture, and whenever I think that things have kind of peaked as far as the different elements that could be introduced, there's yet another interesting layer that's added to it. So we'll talk more about that in context, I'm sure, when we get to your methodologies and whatnot. But really, really cool stuff. How would you characterize your music and your sound?
yeah, so I'm really glad you chose this piece, because it is kind of an encapsulation of sort of my mission. And I guess sort of a through line in my life is always looking at the status quo and wondering why. Well, why don't we do this, or why are things this way? And I kind of always looked at the more classical music oriented side of my education. And I could never participate as a guitarist in certain things, and there were certain kind of like barriers to entry. And so basically the goal with my music as a composer, and specifically with Studio Nouveau, is to use the palette of modern sounds, electronic and beats, and all sorts of things that have been sort of overlooked by sort of the more academic side of like classical music. And because I love classical music, and this piece, for example, is a fugue, an EDM fugue that I wrote, like literally modeled on like a JS Bach, pretty simple fugue, but I just kind of it's more of the point of like, this is what, this is the same structure as like a lauded, classical cornerstone. It just sounds like electronic music. So that's something that is really important to me.
Interesting. So toying with societal norms and expectations within academia or even classical music, where I've heard from other artists that there's a bit of a pushback at the onset sometimes to the notion of of NFTs and what it actually entails. You talked about being a guitarist. Obviously, there's electronic music here. What instruments are you playing? Are you a jack of all trades?
Well, I technically have a degree in music education, and so I can technically play most instruments because I learned how to teach most instruments. But a lot of one thing that was really a big opportunity for me was to really dive deep with electronic, synthesizers and electronic music, which is something I've always loved and been passionate about. But I just never really, like being a guitarist, I just never really had too many opportunities to run with that. And especially working from home, being cooped up in our apartment all during the entire pandemic, it just worked really well to just be able to work electronically. Um, so that's one way to answer that.
I love it. And as an educator, are you still educating, or have you focused on your musicianship full time now?
I love teaching, but I pretty quickly after college went straight into performing. I was pretty lucky to have a really good performing career. So I unfortunately have not spent a ton of time teaching, but I do always love the chance to work with people. And even in the NFT space, I always love the chance to kind of help walk people through things. And so I kind of view that in a pretty broad lens of what being a mentor means in life.
Yes, certainly you are an educator in the NFT space, specifically in audio NFTs, among other things, I am sure. You talk about leaning in here, and especially when COVID hit, it really gave you a little bit of fuel to focus on some of these endeavors. Would you say that your composition or your experimentation has evolved over that time, or is this pretty synonymous with what you've traditionally done?
Well, I would say I basically um, I've written a lot of compositions in the past that might be surprising to people in terms of being like relatively modern, classical sounding. Some pieces are pretty dissonant. I've written pieces for orchestra and for chamber ensembles, in the more classical realm. But I've also written a lot of like jazz music. Um, Studio Nouveau is definitely an evolution in terms of really kind of applying my composition. And there are some Easter eggs in terms of there's a one track from our first album where I do use some electric guitar as well. I minted a solo guitar piece as well as kind of a side series, and I want to do more with that. But I definitely think that, and within Studio Nouveau, especially with our current album and the second album, I've been gradually kind of working with longer form pieces and music because just as a quick note, like on Super Rare, when I started out, the upload limit was kind of low, so it was hard to upload too long of a piece because it wouldn't fit on the platform. So it's kind of interesting how that affects people like myself who work with like video media.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that. When I first started going down the rabbit hole of audio NFTs, I said, well, hey, maybe this is the new norm, right? Like 1.5 minute songs, 60-second songs. And that gave me a little more context to understand the constraints of file size and how that could have played a role there. What would you say, obviously being classically educated and creating compositions that would be structured in ways that commercially would be viable for ballet or orchestra, jazz, as you had mentioned? Do you have major influences, do you say, that would creep into your music that are outside of that realm? For instance, something in pop culture or something that was, influential to you as a child?
Oh yeah, one thing comes immediately to mind, and it's probably the most common thing that I hear sometimes when people hear Nouveau's music is, "Wow, this sounds like a video game or something." And I definitely, I would say a lot of early PlayStation games that I played, like the Final Fantasy series or like Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, or a couple specific games that the
Yes.
soundtracks just definitely, and it's not even, it's really not conscious. It's just, it's there. I just fully admit, like, it's just in my brain and that it kind of comes through in my music. Um, but I also, like I said, I've kind of written music in the past, often that is like maybe more dissonant sounding. But I really wanted to work in kind of write music with Studio Nouveau that is more maybe like accessible sounding, but still profound. And so I kind of wanted to test myself to make things that might sound more sort of consonant, but are still really striking and make people hear things they've never heard before, even so.
Yeah, it's by the way, Chrono Cross, I think Scars of Time is one of my favorite songs of all time. Someone asked me the other day in a car ride, everyone was going around putting their favorite songs, and it was whatever it was, Metallica or something recent, and mine was Scars of Time. But one of your songs, and this actually predates the era of video games that you're saying. One of them reminds me very, very closely to a level in a game that was called Bionic Commando. It was actually an 8-bit game for the NES. I'll have to send it to you sometime. That perhaps without even hearing it, and I don't know, maybe you played it, but it sounded very similar.
Oh, I love that. I'm not familiar with it, but yeah, that's definitely, I would say that's something that I hear a lot, and it's definitely true. And I lean into it. I love the sound of that, like 8-bit. I don't use a lot of like literally 8-bit sounds, but it's definitely an aesthetic that I like and is nostalgic in some ways.
Yeah, for sure. If we could, I'd like to talk a little bit about the visual artistry and how you work to put that together. What's the processes that you guys are using, and from a process standpoint, are you building at the same time? Does one come before the other?
Yeah. So, just as a quick context about my sort of art background, I really I started, so anything that you see, like, I create all the sculptures in Blender and 3D modeling software, and any piece that is in like a 3D modeled environment, I also create that. Um, and I developed this interest. This kind of ties in. The first NFT that I ever purchased was in February 2020. It was land in Decentraland, and that really triggered my interest in NFTs. And so I had this land, and I'm like, well, what am I going to do with this land? I was blown away that I could do whatever I wanted with it. I'm like, I see in some of the tutorials they're using Blender. I'm like, this is really cool. Um, Maybe I can make some like sculptures to put on my land and build some things that way. And so pause there. My partner Kaya, they have a fine art background, so I've kind of been exposed to a lot of academic fine art over the years. And one of my favorite places is called Storm King, and that's in north of New York City. And I we've gone there many times, and so just love 20th century sculpture, and it's definitely a subconscious influence of mine. But that was kind of the genesis of me getting into 3D modeling software and kind of creating it. And I really don't have like a specific influence in terms of the way I sculpt. It's really just my expressing myself. But um, that's kind of explains the 3D element of it. Um, Kaya's involvement is definitely more on the sort of behind the scenes, because they have really extensive, you know, fine art and art history knowledge that I can tap into. So they're like a Photoshop wizard. So if I generate some, I also work with like GAN imagery. So that's kind of like what you're seeing in the background now. I would have created in something like Artbreeder. And so I'll take, sometimes I know what I want to do with them, and I'll send it to Kaya, and they will like splice things together and Photoshop it together, send it back to me. I'll put it together from there. So that's usually the process. I would say for most of our pieces, I'm doing like 95% of the work, and they are providing sort of like a lot of feedback and just it's like a feedback loop. And I really it is so many times made a huge difference. But that kind of is how I would explain the workflow. Is like I'm like getting things started, running things by them, shooting it back to me, um, and then ultimately all of it goes into a video format. So I'm using, Final Cut Pro, running all the different assets into that software and creating a video output for a lot, especially these video pieces. Our current album is more audio focused with static images, but I'll pause there.
No, that's great. And there's some questions, people asking, relative to the visuals. Is are you using AI again, and any specifics you could share with them as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I also around the same time that I started with 3D modeling also, I was specifically when I started researching NFTs, I really became excited and enamored with Super Rare, and specifically with Robbie Barrett's AI generated nude portrait series. I don't know if everyone is familiar with. I hope you are familiar with them. And I just thought it was the coolest thing, and just exploring his work more, I was so that was kind of my first real introduction to AI art. And so I just wanted to find a way to experiment with that myself. And I found the website Art Breeder. That was kind of a lot of the first two albums, like that is all using Art Breeder for the sort of more GAN based imagery. And it just I it was so exhilarating to, explore a whole new area of creativity for me. And you know, it just allowed me to create this sort of world. And that's something that I kind of a mission of mine with Studio Nouveau is to create like e- everything is supposed to feel like part of this cohesive universe, that is foreign and yet it all kind of seems related as well. But that's kind of my history with using more AI oriented art.
Great. Thank you for that context. And there's some people talking about it in our stream text chat. I wanted to call out, you have this meticulous log here of your mints, starting shortly after I had met you in the whale server. So I think that was around July of 2020. And 2 months later, you were minting nearly 2 years ago to this day. If this was indeed your first mint, I know sometimes there can be some experiments out there.
Yeah, I should say, and I like to tell people that was actually not the very first mint, because as I mentioned on Super Rare, I got accepted into Super Rare in early July of 2020. And like I said, with those file size restrictions, it kind of, it was really difficult for me to figure out how to get them to fit, basically. And so I came to the point where I'm like, I'd like to redo some of these. And so that was why the ultimately our genesis ends up being in August. But the interesting thing is that metadata still exists for those early tokens. They're just not accessible because they're in the super rare burn address. So I just think that's an interesting thing to share with people, is that you technically can't really burn an NFT. You just make it inaccessible.
Right. You try to hide the evidence, but it's still there. People want to look and
Yeah.
find it. And I find interesting things. There's rivalries and there's divergent philosophies in the NFT space that digging around wallets you could find when they were kin at one point, right? And best friends. So very interesting, the blockchain and what it can tell us. So talk to me a little bit about this journey. You're on Super Rare, and then I see you expanded out. You're doing some work with Rarible, even Block Party, for those that may or may not have ventured in for some recent drops that were interesting. Maker's Place. Obviously, you talked about DC, where you were making wearables for your parcel, and I believe you had an exhibit an exhibition of some sort, or perhaps you put some of your work up there, if I recall correctly. First Dibs. So, your journey through these platforms and your different iterations. Anything significant to you in that progression?
Yeah, it's definitely a good segue into sort of one of my main goals. Like from the outset was, you know, e- even in summer 2020, it was pretty early on in sort of experimenting with different musical concepts and NFTs. And I really wanted to explore what an album framework could look like for music and NFTs. And so the concept was to create a one of one NFT for every track of the album. And then if you watch the video for the final track, which is self-titled as the album audio visual, you'll notice in that video that there is a montage of all of the Etherscan transactions for the minting of each of the NFTs on the album. And so basically, what I wanted to kind of try, it was an experiment, like how can I make a cohesive NFT music album? And so my vision for it was to have a one of one NFT per track. Um, I don't know if you want to check this one out, but I can also keep talking.
Sure. If you'd like to run this one, we could run this one as well for everyone.
I think this is an important one, personally.
Sure.
And I'll just as a little context too, um, it the way that I structured this, and the same with the second album, the final track of each album, it contains musical themes that I use in each of the previous tracks. So it's sort of like a musical montage to tie it all together. So even though all the tracks are separate NFTs, I'm like using this one as sort of like a north star of the album. And same, the GAN imagery in this one, I use all the images from the other tracks and combined it to create the output that you see. And this one was particularly Photoshop heavy on
Right.
Kai's end.
So this is the capstone piece, the culmination of all the different components. If you wanted to have, the premier representation of this work, this would be it. So let's take a listen. Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, so that was basically the concept for the first album. And the evolution to the second album was taking the concept of like finding a way to cohesively um, you know, produce a collection of NFTs as a music album to a cross-platform album. So that's why the second album is across a bunch of different platforms, because I wanted to show that because of the modular nature of NFTs, you can have an album that's meant to be a cohesive piece live across different contracts. And the final track of the second album, which actually wasn't minted too long ago, um, which is the title track, In Motion, was minted on our Manifold custom contract. So it has all these different platforms, and then the capstone piece is minted on a custom Manifold contract. And it's a similar, that one's much longer. And so with the second album, I sort of branch out. I have higher upload limits on some of these other platforms. And I was able to kind of produce longer pieces of music. So long story short, that's a huge, and we're moving on. That's really the idea, is to just keep doing this. Like each new album has its own set of themes and objectives, but it's ultimately meant to sort of demonstrate to people like how musicians might approach a music album in this new paradigm.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Did you find now, obviously, there's a lot going on with people finding their way with experimentation from a creative standpoint, and also um, from the market, from the collectors and how they participate with the creatives. That's an evolving landscape as well. What did you find for differences and similarities in having this modular release where it went across different platforms versus when you had it all in one concentric place?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was a really nice experience, getting to kind of make a lot of new friends across different platforms. So it was rewarding in that sense. Um, I would I would say in terms of collectors, there's quite a few of these pieces are still not. I mean, some of them have been collected relatively recently, but it was actually a little bit of a challenge to maybe get visibility in some cases. Um, I know that the block party pieces were snapped up the day of, which was really fun. Um, but I will say some of them took a while to be collected and are actually still available, which isn't too big of a concern for me. But you know, it's it was. I'm glad I did the experiment, but maybe you lose a little bit of an element of consistency with releasing your work on in one place with one community. So um, definitely a mixed number of lessons in there. But I'm definitely glad that I tried it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I know a lot of the philosophies as to why you're an advocate for the NFT space and why it's so engaging and interesting to you to participate here. But if you could just highlight some of the key points from, how you feel it empowers creatives to, how disruptive you think it is to the industry, what would be some of the key highlights as to why you are excited about this technology in particular?
Yeah, I think that for me, I've always been. I feel like it still doesn't make sense to people when I say this, but I really do apply the concept of crypto art and art NFTs to music directly in the same way. And I view it in a similar manner too. Crypto art, it basically makes digital works. It is a proof of concept for a piece that you mint, and it makes it tangibly collectible. I view NFTs as digital artifacts that you create, much like in when you make a physical painting, that is sort of an artifact of your physical creation. And that's how I view the medium of NFTs. It's sort of the digital. It really just comes down to like understanding blockchain technology and decentralized crypto in general. Digital ownership, and that translates to creative works as well in the digital space. And so, what crypto art has done for visual artists is just empower decades worth of digital creators that have not had a way to have their work collected in a meaningful or tangible way, really, apart from like thumb drives. But it just seems like such a huge step up. And so I would apply that. Basically, what my early light bulb moment was seeing super rare and thinking, wow, like as a composer, like I would love to mint my music as a one of one NFT every time I finish a piece. Like, yes. And so I pretty quickly just wanted to find a way to do that. So um, I really do view, um, sometimes people refer to one of one NFTs as sort of like artificial scarcity, but I would say that it's sort of minting when you finish a piece of art or a piece of music. It is a single thing, and so I personally don't view it as any more artificial than minting editions versus a one of one. So that's why I've always you know kept Studio Nouveau's work as a one of one NFT, because I really believe in that concept for music as well. So just those are some general themes that I think are really important.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that anyone that doesn't should definitely give you a follow. Definitely one of the the best follows when it comes to audio NFTs in the space. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention your participation in the ecosystem, in the evolution and support of everything that happens as a collector. So not only as a creative, but you are one of the most active collectors in audio NFTs. You have an incredible vault that you've amassed, and I got to be honest with you. There was a couple of things that I've been fence sitting on that you went in and scooped before me, Joe Craig. But either way, there's definitely a robust collection there. I'd love to ask you a few questions. As a collector, what inspired you to lean in so heavily?
Yeah, I kind of view it as an analog to the early days of crypto art. There were so many artists who were really important to driving that movement. And I basically it the early impetus was just viewing it as such a huge um, opportunity. Really, just it is such an inefficiency that music is not, is so far behind the visual arts that it just seemed like I just have to do this. Like I believe in it so strongly that um, if no one else sees this but me, like I just have to do this. And it feels funny to me. I would probably make the claim that the Studio Nouveau music NFT collection has probably the most number of music grails out of any collection. I would make that claim. Anyone's welcome to. But I'm proud of it. I'm proud of an artist-driven movement. And I think that's really important. And so it's supporting my colleagues. It's about expressing my conviction in music and NFTs. And I don't expect any financial return from it. It is purely out of love and wanting to help the ecosystem grow. Um, so yeah, that's just a couple things I would say about it.
I love it. Thank you for the context. How do you go about curating your collection? Like you said, you have grails besides just being early. You're somewhat selective in what you pick. Obviously, I would like to think so, being that you scooped one of the one things I had my eyes on for some time. But you do have an amazing collection, and you have to keep your ear to the streets and online to just be on top of things. How do you go about curating? What's your philosophy in the way that you're collecting audio NFTs?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's about studying the history of the space. And so, I sort of on the visual side, I look to, or in general, I look to what is the credibility layer of a given part of the NFT space. And for me, I've always viewed super rare as the credibility layer, so to speak, of the visual art space in NFTs. And so, for example, very early on when Art Blocks launched as a platform, some of my favorite artists, Lux Priest, I saw his elevated deconstructions drop was the first thing I saw on Art Blocks, and I saw, artists who weren't super rare, and that gave it a sense of credibility for me. And so that's why I have quite a big Art Blocks collection that I paid very little for. Um, and so I basically translate that concept to music NFTs. And as I mentioned very early on, I was very inspired by super rare. Obviously, chose to mint there, but I always wondered like, where's the super rare of music NFTs? That's what I want to mint on. And so catalog comes along, and pretty quickly I just know like this is it. User, the design is beautiful. The user interface is great. So day one, I was like the first person to bid on catalog, and just the incredibly interesting music that they put on the platform, it just since day one has just always reinforced itself for me as just something I believe in so strongly, and hence why our third album with Studio Nouveau, we've been minting on catalog, and the whole album will be there. So and if you look at catalog, what catalog is represented for the space, so many artists that have come from catalog have represented top artists on other platforms, or artists that platforms try to bring on, much like Super Rare represents for the broader art NFT space. So that is kind of one, and but also a very important thing that I'm not saying here is also pre-catalog, like the OGs and pioneers who built the space before that as well. So that is something that's really important to me as well. So it's really, I just think, the best way to filter things is to study history and know where the credibility is, who the builders are, and who are really doing interesting things and pushing boundaries.
Great context there and great philosophy. Maybe I should apply it a little bit more to the way I collect, which is kind of anything. Just sometimes if it bangs, it bangs, right? And I apply that to visual arts and get suckered into stuff that I just think is dope, whether I have that full context or not. But with music, I think you could do a little bit of both because I think I think it straddles a little bit of both worlds in some ways. What would you give for advice for new people who are on the fringe, interested in participating and collecting audio NFTs, but they're apprehensive to get in? They feel like they can't justify the outlay or they don't really understand the value proposition.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, something that is very important to me is, um, you know, don't don't spend more than you can afford to. Try to, you know, find something that is a reasonable price for you to pay. But also, even before that, it is simply, if you love it, you can't go wrong. Assuming you're using money that is okay for you to, use for buying NFTs. Um, Really find something that you truly love, and if I think there's so much amazing music on catalog, but if for some reason you're just not finding something that is resonating with you, try to help onboard an artist who you really do like a lot. And so that's maybe one way that I would think about it.
Yeah, no, great advice. I know you have some commitments and we're up against time. I have a bunch of questions left for you, but I did have a track that I set aside that you had alluded to at the beginning. So I want to make sure I play it for the audience to check it out. And that would be Sirens with the aforementioned guitar work. So I'm going to drop this for everyone and then we can resume the conversation. And there is some guitar work, incredible for someone that may have only heard some of the electronic instruments and seeing you get in there and really flex with some of your musical prowess.
Yeah, I had to get something in there at some point. I thought it would be fun. I'm kind of a little disappointed that I haven't done more, but hey, I'm sure it'll happen again.
Just a quick note for everyone. We will be having a POAP here at Whale. We are stepping up our Web3 integration, and POAPs will be a big part of unlocking different gated features within the Whale members community. So the best way to participate is to have the POAP app on your phone. There is a button on the bottom right-hand corner that will say Mint. You'll click that, click secret phrase, and when we give you the secret phrase, you will be able to mint. To remind everybody, there is a limited supply as we're trying to make sure that we keep this to reward the people that actually do participate and take part in learning about the incredible artists and discussions that we do have. So get your phone ready. The POAP will drop soon. I see you guys in the chat. You guys are something else. But another question I had for you, Tor. For musicians, fan interaction is such a key component for market presence. How do you feel NFTs help enhance this connectivity?
Yeah, I think it depends. I think there's a lot of ways that you can approach it, and I love Twitter and I love the crypto Twitter and NFT Twitter communities. It They were definitely a lifeline for me during the pandemic. You know, having to stay inside quite often, um, and I think that things like POAPs, for example, are really awesome. And that's something actually some of our earliest NFTs were POAPs from our early events in Decentraland. Um, but for me, the idea with Studio Nouveau was to really focus more on the art, whether or not people liked it. It is really to make things that I think are really cool, and with my partner, and here show it to the world as pieces of art. And so I'm personally less concerned about things like mass appeal and trying to have a ton of people behind it. I'm more about saying the most meaningful thing possible, and it really is meaningful for me when people resonate with that. So that's kind of how I think about like sort of fan engagement. And I think there's a lot of, like I said, there's many ways that people can approach it, and NFTs are great for that. But when you're minting one of one NFTs, there's only so many to go around. So that is maybe one challenge in terms of like um, building huge network effects. But I've tried to use other things to reward people who have been supportive to us from the beginning, aside from just the main one of one NFTs. But just yeah, that's kind of how I think about it a little bit.
That's it's interesting you say that. That's one of the things that made me so excited to see the early success of catalog when it was happening, and that it really strips it down, right? It's not a lot of bells and whistles. It's not a lot of features. It's really putting the music at the forefront and saying this is what has value. Sure, you can put a cover and people have done different things, but many people just have something simple and say the emphasis is the music, the art is what's valuable here. And the market responded. Collectors came in and agreed with that. And I think that's changing that paradigm and changing that mentality for something that's been commoditized to the level that it has been with streaming services and everything else is major. So like you said, there's limited supply, so there's only so much of it that can happen. But you know, it very well could have launched and stagnated for some time, and instead, what we did is we quickly saw that this did resonate with people, and it was something that they believed in.
Yeah, I think the concept, people talk about the concept of like 1,000 true fans, or sort of like that. What is most exciting about NFTs for me is the concept of one true fan, and empowering people who make music that might only have a very limited appeal. And so that's almost more interesting to me personally. And I think, everyone has different reasons for wanting to be in the space, and that's the beautiful thing about it. But I'm kind of like advocating for the more niche, maybe like underground uh, art and music. That's really exciting to me.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. If even if one person loves it, or you get people that hate it, apathy is the worst thing that can happen to art, right? So having one fan could mean the world. It's not necessarily all in the numbers. Guys, we're coming up on the end here, so I wanted to make sure I shared the secret phrase. Have your POAP app open. The secret phrase for today's show with Studio Nouveau is audio visual. Again, audio visual for the POAP secret phrase. I had a question for you. I was going to ask if the participatory nature of music and the way that people interact with it and consume it, if that warrants a different approach for artists in the NFT space than visual artists. But go ahead.
Yeah, it's I definitely think that that's true for many people, for many musicians. But for me personally, and I do think others too, um, my my most meaningful musical experiences were solitary ones. And some of my most vivid musical memories of just having my mind blown by music was like, one, for example, was the first time I listened to Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, a recording in my bedroom when I was like, I don't know, 13 years old or something. And it was like a thunderstorm outside. And I can just vividly remember just having my mind blown by that piece. And, listening to just, I can remember so many moments of just myself listening to music. And so that might kind of influence how I think about it. I do think that the format of just being able to listen to it on your computer is, that's kind of what I try to create. I try to create an experience that you could just, it is the way you see it is the way I want you to experience it. And my goal is to help you experience something that you may have never felt before, which I know all of my favorite musical experiences, like I'm describing, were things that I never had felt before. Um, so I totally, obviously, there's like, live music is a beautiful thing, a core, yeah, tenet of human creative culture. But I do think that those solitary experiences are enabled by recorded music. And I think NFTs are kind of a fork in the road for the history of recorded music, much like digital files are able to have digital provenance with NFTs as well. So
Wow. Yeah. And so many times I have discussions with super smart people like yourself that are way more embedded in this, and I have to reshape the paradigm that I view this in. And sometimes with visual arts, we had a discussion this morning in a show we have called Natively Digital, where we try to look at Web3 and the NFT space through the lens of just art and culture. And there was some discussion relative to appeal of visual arts versus physical arts. And one thing that definitely stood out to me is that I find beauty in the code. The fact that this is on chain adds an element of the artistry to me. And certainly with visual arts, I can make that connection easier because I can understand generative art and things where the code actually takes action, or people like Pac who use it for performance art, so to speak, right? And so I think I can't even wrap my head around how that will be leveraged here with music, but when I try to, I get excited about the possibilities.
100%. And yeah, no, I've always felt that minting an NFT, utilizing best practices is a craft. And I think people might think it's funny to think of it that way. Oh, you just press a button and mint. Like, well, you're using the artist wallet that is controlled by the private key that only you can access. And you're using a historical contract on a respected platform, or you're using a custom contract that only you control. I think that there is a craft to understanding that and to pinning your own IPFS media. Like all of that comes into the craft of being an NFT creator, in my opinion.
Right. Like someone chefing up your food, meticulously sprinkling the spices like it's going to be delicious and you're excited to eat it because you're excited about it. So I can definitely relate in my own weird analogous ways. You did a lot of experimentation. I'm sure there's more on deck. What would you say were some highlight learnings that were kind of aha moments in your experimentation? And that you could say were highlights and that you would carry with you forward?
Yeah, I think just the open nature of NFT media. That was definitely something that maybe took a little time for me to understand. Was you know, I in the beginning, I think I definitely viewed the media as like an exclusive experience, but I always keep coming back to the Hackatow adage of anyone can view it, anyone can stream it, one owns it. And so that's why I have all of our music on streaming platforms, all the videos on YouTube, because it can proliferate in that way. And that's what I think is the most beautiful thing about NFTs, and has been a really such a beautiful realization for me, is that um, anyone can appreciate it, and that's what makes this such an important medium going forward.
Right. I love that. So with the different platforms that you've experimented on, what are some things, and we don't have to name specifics, but what are some things that you think are being done right with the emergence of platforming for for audio NFTs? And what do you think are some opportunities that still can be worked on?
It's kind of amazing to me all the resources that exist for, artists and musicians entering the space now. I mean, gosh, I wish I had access to Manifold, for example, when I started out. The options were so much more limited. So I think in that way, there there's such a plethora of options that I almost feel that there are very few limits, really. I think it's an incredible time for people to get started. I personally think the way that Super Rare is approaching decentralized curation is so important, and I'm not sure if people really realize, but I think it is the blueprint for the future of this space. And so that is one particular shining light that I appreciate, is the way that they've approached their spaces system. And I think there's often kind of this debate about like gatekeepers in the space, but I think it's so important to sort of to move past that and to realize that there are so many options, and curation is celebrating art. It is making a choice about the things that we want to uphold, and there are so many ways to participate in that. And if you really care about the platform, like be a voting member, and maybe even start your own space. So that's why I feel like that system is really important, because it kind of provides a way for everyone to truly participate in a way that still elevates the art, and in a way that's separate from just open free for all situations, which are important and they're also good. um, but I particularly like the way they've done that.
Yeah, I like that, especially in light of there's been some challenges with some of the other platforms and people for whatever reason taking issue with the curation and accessibility of it. But I also think that, like you said, there is an opportunity for something more open to happen as well. I mean, Lord knows I know half of the music that I do, and I'm a huge fan of because of a mix that a friend had made for me, right? And their social flagging or giving me a little bit of input helped me on my journey of artist discovery. And I think that's one of the challenges, I think, for a lot of people. Of course, you can go to catalog and just peruse what's new, but not everybody, is going to do that if that's not already kind of vested. And I think one of the challenges I grapple with, because I curate a room here on Whale where I try to just share things with people that I, caught my attention that I think are cool, essentially a mixtape. And I don't know if people don't know how to engage or they're apprehensive to approach it, but I'm trying to think, how do we bridge the uninitiated collectors in this space? Because I know that they are interested. They get intrigued when they see lots of different things, but I think audio takes a little bit of a different investment. You can scroll on Twitter and you see really quickly something that catches your eye. Audio, you kind of have to be invested to sit down and hear it. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how we can overcome that bridge.
Well, I have, honestly, like I've expressed this before maybe, but um, it's as simple as this. Like, if you think about before Beeple made the $69 million sale, it was also a hard sell for crypto art. Like, it was so hard for people to get on board with that. Oh, right click save, oh haha. But once the huge sale happens, Oh, I knew it all along, oh, okay, yeah, of course, crypto art, so unfortunately, maybe it might be cynical of me to say, but you know, once that happens with music, I expect the similar, a pretty similar thing to happen because there is no logical reason for music to not have a similar standing as visual arts, in my opinion. And, if you, so that's just how I think about it. I think that for some people, it's just going to take that price and market results to inspire them to participate. But, it's I fully acknowledge it is further out on the risk curve because of that. Not The numbers really are pretty darn good, I would say. I remember when Super Rare passed their like $1 million sales metric. Catalog has made like $3 million in primary sales, and Sound.xyz has made an enormous amount of volume in secondary sales. But it's just going to take some time, and I'll be here either way. So
Yeah, no, for sure. There's a lot of momentum for audio NFTs, and this is just anecdotally from my participation on Twitter and being a musician myself, and also what we see here within the community. It's like there are people very vested in it. There are people that, as creatives, they're tied to it and they're really part of the movement. And there's a lot of people that are coming externally, being made aware because I think there's a groundswell of education happening with people that are in the music, creatives in music, and that are trying to onboard other people and say, hey, look what Web3 affords you to be able to do to circumvent these challenges, to interact directly with fans and the community. So I think there's those two groups for sure pushing it, and I think there's a lot of gas that could be put on this movement to capture the middle. And I'd be intrigued to see how that happens. Perhaps it's by a big sale, like you mentioned. I have a couple of questions from the community. Do you have a few more minutes to spend with us, or do you got to skedaddle?
no, let's do it. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, I got some people DM me sometimes because they're shy. One person wants to know what happened to your Decentraland gallery.
Oh, I need to work on it. I poured it into Decentraland recently, and like half of the building was backwards for some reason, and I don't know why. So I took it down for now. We do have two spots, and the west side spot is still there, but I I need to go in to the terminal and re-upload it. So apologies for that.
Okay. Well, I guess they were doing some homework and exploring prior to the stream. Any future metaverse plans beyond what you had before?
Yeah, I would love to do more events like I used to do back in the day. I've just basically, as we've gone on with Studio Nouveau, I just keep upping the ante in terms of like how involved each project is. So I have less and less time to dedicate to building, my metaverse builds and putting on events and things. So I definitely want to do more with that. I kind of need to prioritize our work first, ultimately, but watch this space on that.
Great. Someone wants to know, do you use AI in any of your music? And if not, when will you?
I don't actually. That's kind of, I guess, an interesting aspect because I use AI in some of the visual elements. I personally, I prefer to. I don't like to use AI elements in my own music. I definitely use like arpeggiators sometimes, so I'm using things that are that work that way. But ultimately, that's kind of my concept is using like old school classical techniques um, with electronic sounds, and I think that's just going to come from my brain for the foreseeable future. So,
Interesting. Someone wants to know, in music, some people gain traction with free distribution models. What would be the equivalent of passing out a mixtape in NFTs?
yeah, I mean, you could airdrop an NFT mixtape. I think I feel like I've even had that happen to me before too. So, digital ownership, you can do the same thing with a audio NFT as well. I think that's awesome. That's a really cool idea. I
Someone's
love
thinking
that
there.
analogy.
Someone's thinking there. Any advice you would give to musicians that are confused on how to make their entrance in audio NFTs?
Yeah, I would personally think about a long-term roadmap for yourself. I feel like I hear sometimes people say like, "Don't think about it, just jump in." I'm not the person that would say that. I know when I first came into the space, I really took time to like learn about the space and think about what I wanted to do. And so I just encourage people to study a little bit of history about the space, study where the most credible points of the industry are, because that's really, in my opinion, where you want to gravitate towards. There are such a large number of people trying to kind of glom on to the buzzword that music NFTs has become, that you kind of need to be careful about what you get involved with, because your creative work is precious and you want to be really sure about the steps you take. So I encourage people to um, go relatively slow and learn and reach out to people like myself, ask questions. I'm always glad to help people find their way. So that's what people did when I started out. People were super generous and helped me in a lot of ways too. So
Yes, indeed. I remember some of the conversations in those early summer months 2 years ago. What's next for you? Where should people stay involved and watch for what you got on deck?
yeah, really, our journey onto catalog is what is happening right now, and it's going to be a full album of pieces. I've definitely stepped up. These are definitely the most involved pieces of music I've ever written in my life. Probably this one you're showing on the screen is. I'm incredibly proud of this piece, and I have the one I'm working on now is I'm really excited to release this as well. As you can tell, it has AI generated visuals. I've been working with Mid Journey, which I absolutely love, and it has, but I like edit the image with Kaya's help and to get the sculptures in there as well. And all of these pieces come with 3D sculptures as well. So it's really meant to be an extension of the same concept we've been working with, but just on, in slightly different ways for each album. You can catch us on our Discord. Um, Hopefully, do some metaverse events. Follow me on Twitter for Twitter's probably the best place to see what's to come.
Awesome. Got some late questions coming in, which I appreciate that people are paying attention. Someone asks, can artists have success born out of audio NFTs alone? I have to kind of interpret this, but I guess they're saying if they're not coming in as a pre-existing, without a pre-existing fan base of their music, and they're just going to debut in NFTs, do you think that's a viable path?
Well, it's interesting you say that because that was literally the goal with Studio Nouveau was to start from scratch. We started from scratch, and I really, and in a metaverse native way, because I had this established career as a guitarist, and I'm never one to kind of like talk about blockchain and crypto with people. I'm not the kind of like guy in the room who's like, "Hey, do you know about crypto?" I like never do that. So it was kind of my creating Studio Nouveau was also a way to keep it separate, really, and to start from scratch. So, if anything, I really hope that what we've done can show people that yes, you can get started from scratch, and especially, I think they mentioned with only audio. Absolutely, I think you have to have patience. I think the space is still growing, and I would just measure success in years, not days. I think that I notice people sometimes get really anxious when they kind of maybe don't sell right away, but any Studio Nouveau piece took longer than a month to sell that we've sold. So, um, you know, I'm really, I definitely encourage you to go for it.
Awesome. And looks like the last one of the more dissonant and crunchy music you've composed, can you suggest your favorite work for us to listen to?
Well, I haven't released it. Um, I have some ideas about maybe future things where I do like electronic orchestrations of previous pieces that I've written, but they're actually not really out there. So um, maybe watch out for that in the future as well.
Stay tuned. You got the hook. You got the hooks in us, tour. And with that, my friend, I'll say thank you for spending an hour. I have so many other questions I'd love to ask you. Hopefully, in one of your upcoming releases, you'd be receptive to coming back here. We'd love to talk with you again and chop it up on audio NFTs. The space moves very fast, and likely by then we'll have a whole new set of things to discuss. Thank you once again so much for joining us. It was a great conversation.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
I have what was one of my favorite tracks, and kind of going down the rabbit hole of your music that I will take everyone out with, and this is Portal's Departure. Tor, have a great one.
Thanks.